Okay, so today we're diving into something that I think is pretty fascinating in the world of global trade. And, we've been seeing a lot of these kinds of stories pop up lately, but this one particularly caught my eye.
Oh, yeah, definitely a lot happening these days with all the, trade negotiations and tariffs flying around.
Right, exactly. And this one is about India and how they're considering lowering tariffs on a lot of stuff that comes from the U.S. We're talking over half of all U.S. imports, which is a pretty big chunk of change, like $23 billion worth.
Wow, yeah, that's significant. And what's really interesting is it seems to be directly tied to the possibility of the U.S. slapping reciprocal tariffs on India in return.
Yeah, like a tit for tat kind of thing, potentially affecting a huge portion of what India sends over here, something like 87% of their exports to the U.S. So This is a pretty high stakes situation.
Absolutely high stakes. And it really highlights how interconnected global trade is. One country makes a move and then another reacts, and it creates this ripple effect.
So for everyone listening today, that's kind of what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive. What could happen if these tariffs actually change? Why do countries even use tariffs in the first place? And what can we learn from similar situations that have happened in the past?
Yeah, I think by the end of this, we'll all have a much better grasp on the forces that are shaping global trade right now.
Exactly. Okay, so let's get right into it. What's the deal with India and these potential tariff cuts? What are they thinking?
Well, as you mentioned, they're thinking about significantly reducing their import taxes on a whole bunch of goods that come from the U.S., up to that $23 billion figure.
Right. And I'm guessing this isn't just out of the goodness of their hearts. There's got to be some strategy here.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't some sudden burst of international friendship or anything. It's definitely a calculated move and likely a preemptive one to try and lessen the blow of those potential U.S. tariffs that are looming over them.
So like a way to soften the punch before it even lands.
Exactly.
They're trying to position themselves strategically, maybe even gain a bit of leverage in future negotiations by showing they're willing to play ball and open up their market to certain U.S. goods.
Kind of like a bargaining chip.
Precisely.
So that makes sense from a strategic point of view, but let's say these tariff reductions actually happen. What could that mean? What are the potential upsides and downsides?
Well, the positive side is usually pretty clear. Whenever tariffs go down, trade tends to flow more easily.
Makes sense. Less barriers, less hassle.
Exactly. So we'd probably see more goods going back and forth between the U.S. and India.
More business for companies on both sides.
Exactly. And with that comes potential economic benefits. Lower tariffs mean lower costs for businesses that are importing things.
And that could lead to more investment and jobs and all that good stuff.
Right. And for the average consumer, you might start seeing a wider variety of products available from the U.S. and maybe even at lower prices.
More choice and cheaper prices. Who doesn't love that? Exactly. But of course, it's not all sunshine and roses. There are potential challenges for India, too.
Right. What are some of the downsides they'd need to think about?
Well, the main one is increased competition for businesses within India if all these imported goods become cheaper because of the lower tariffs that puts pressure on local companies to compete.
So some Indian companies might really struggle to keep up.
That's the risk they might need to find ways to innovate, become more efficient, or risk losing market share.
Yeah, kind of a sink or swim situation for them.
In a way. And then there's also the bigger geopolitical picture to consider.
Right, like how this affects the overall relationship between the two countries.
Exactly. Stronger trade ties often go hand in hand with stronger diplomatic relations. It can build trust and cooperation on a broader scale.
So it's not just about the economics, it's about international relations too. Okay, so we keep talking about tariffs, but I think it's worth taking a step back for a second and really explaining what they are and why countries use them.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to assume everyone knows, but it's a fundamental part of understanding global trade.
So in the simplest terms, what's a tariff?
A tariff is basically a tax that a country puts on goods that are coming in from another country.
And why would they do that? What's the point?
Well, there are several reasons countries use tariffs, and they can vary a lot depending on the country's goals and its economic situation.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Definitely not. So if we look at the United States, for example, they've often used tariffs to try and protect their own industries from foreign competition.
Kind of like shielding them from being undercut by cheaper imports.
Exactly. And sometimes they use tariffs as a way to try and influence other countries' behavior, as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations like we see with China.
Sort of like saying, hey, if you don't play by our rules, we're going to make it more expensive for you to sell your stuff here.
Right. It could be a way to try and force concessions or change trade practices. But of course, that can also backfire and disrupt supply chains, as we've seen.
And what about the European Union? How do they tend to use tariffs?
The EU is interesting because they act as a single unit when it comes to trade. So they have these common external tariffs that apply to goods coming in from outside the bloc.
Kind of like a unified front.
Exactly. And their approach is usually focused on protecting the interests of all their member states collectively.
Okay, but even with all that protection, haven't they been hurt by some of these recent global trade wars?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the biggest economies in the EU, like Germany and the UK, have seen their growth forecasts downgraded because of all the uncertainty and disruption caused by these back and forth tariffs.
So even when you're trying to protect yourself, you can still get caught in the crossfire.
That's the thing about global trade. It's all interconnected.
And what about developing countries? How do they use tariffs?
Well, for them, tariffs can be really important for helping to nurture their own industries that are just starting out.
Yeah.
They might not be able to compete with big international companies right away, so tariffs give them a bit of breathing room.
Kind of like a protective barrier while they get their footing.
Exactly. It lets them develop their own production capabilities and become more competitive over time.
And sometimes tariffs can be a big source of income for those governments too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in countries where other forms of tax collection might be more challenging.
So it's a way to generate revenue for things like infrastructure and social programs.
Right. And then you have countries that are heavily reliant on imports for essential things like oil.
What happens when tariffs get involved there?
That can get really tricky because tariffs on essential imports like oil end up driving up costs for those countries.
And those increased costs can trickle down to businesses and consumers.
Exactly. You might see higher energy prices, which can have a ripple effect throughout the whole economy, potentially even leading to inflation.
Okay, so we've got this big picture view of tariffs now, but let's make it a bit more concrete by looking at some specific examples from history.
Yeah, I think history can teach us a lot about how tariffs actually play out in the real world.
For sure. So what are some of the big cautionary tales?
Well, one of the most famous examples is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the U.S. back in 1930.
Oh yeah, that one always comes up in economics classes.
For good reason, it's a classic example of how tariffs can backfire spectacularly. The idea behind it was to protect American farmers and manufacturers during the Great Depression.
Sort of like trying to boost the U.S. economy by making foreign goods more expensive.
Exactly. They slapped huge tariffs on thousands of imported products.
But it didn't really work out too well, did it?
Not at all. In fact, it made things much worse. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, and pretty soon global trade just ground to a halt.
Like everyone was trying to protect themselves, but they all ended up worse off.
Exactly. And a lot of economists believe that Smoot-Hawley actually deepened the Depression. It's a stark reminder that protectionist measures can have unintended consequences and sometimes even make the problems you're trying to solve even worse.
So a good lesson from history. Are there other examples we can learn from?
Definitely. How about the Corn Laws in Britain in the 19th century?
Okay, tell me about those.
So these were tariffs that were placed on imported grain, mainly to protect British farmers from foreign competition.
Seems like a common theme.
It is, but the problem was that these tariffs made food prices go way up, which really hurt the poor and working class people.
So it backfired on the people they were supposedly trying to help.
Exactly. There were riots and protests, and eventually the government had to repeal the Corn Laws.
People power.
Yeah, it was a big victory for the free trade movement, and it showed that protectionism could have really negative social consequences.
Okay. And any other examples from the U.S., maybe?
Well, there's the Tariff of Abominations from 1828. That one was all about protecting industries in the North, but it ended up really angering the South because their economy depended on imported goods.
So it created this huge rift between the North and the South.
Yeah, and a lot of historians believe it actually contributed to the tensions that eventually led to the Civil War.
Wow, so tariffs can even have major political ramifications.
Absolutely. They can be a flashpoint for all sorts of social and political issues.
Okay, and one more example to bring it a bit closer to the present.
How about China's retaliatory tariffs back in 2018?
Oh, yeah, I remember that one when the U.S. put tariffs on a bunch of Chinese goods and China fired back.
Exactly. They specifically targeted things like American soybeans, which really hurt farmers in the U.S.
So it became this very direct and painful tit-for-tat exchange.
Exactly. It shows how quickly these tariff wars can escalate and how specific industries can get caught in the crosshairs.
Okay, so we've seen how tariffs can have all sorts of unintended consequences and sometimes even lead to bigger problems. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the potential benefits of reducing tariffs through trade agreements.
Right. So when countries come together and agree to lower tariffs on each other's goods, That can unlock a lot of positive things.
Like, what kind of benefits are we talking about?
Well, for starters, it often leads to increased economic growth for all the countries involved.
Because everyone has more access to bigger markets.
Exactly. Businesses can sell more of their products to a wider range of customers, and consumers get more choices and often lower prices.
Sounds like a win-win.
And it goes beyond just that. Increased competition in a more open market can actually push companies to innovate and become more efficient.
So they have to up their game to stay competitive.
Right. It can drive progress and improve the quality of goods and services for everyone.
And we talked about this before, but those stronger trade ties can also lead to better diplomatic relations, right?
Absolutely. It fosters trust and cooperation and can help smooth over differences between countries.
More stability and collaboration on the world stage.
Exactly. And another benefit is that businesses can often optimize their supply chains when tariffs are lower.
Meaning they can source materials and components from wherever it's most efficient.
Right. It helps them become more competitive and keep costs down.
But we have to be realistic. There must be some potential downsides to reducing tariffs too, right?
Of course, it's not always a smooth ride. Certain industries within a country might struggle to compete with the influx of cheaper imports.
So there could be job losses or businesses going under.
That's a possibility. And governments need to be prepared to support those affected workers and industries through the transition.
Sort of like helping them adapt to the new landscape.
Exactly. But overall, the long-term benefits for consumers having access to more affordable goods usually outweigh those short-term challenges.
Okay, so it's about finding that balance between short-term adjustments and long-term gains. Now, India's not exactly new to this whole trade agreement thing. What's their track record like when it comes to reducing tariffs?
Oh, they've got plenty of experience. They've been actively involved in various trade agreements over the years that include lowering tariffs.
Like, what are some of the big ones?
Well, one that stands out is the India-Asian Free Trade Agreement.
Oh, okay, what did that one do?
That one led to significant tariff cuts on a wide range of goods between India and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
A lot of countries involved there.
Yes. A big block, and it really boosted trade in key sectors like electronics, textiles, and agriculture.
So a success story.
Definitely. And then there's the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA, that India has with South Korea.
CEPA, got it. What's that one all about?
This one also involved lowering tariffs, and it really boosted trade between those two countries, particularly in things like automobiles, electronics, and chemicals.
So targeting specific industries for growth.
Exactly. And then there's the India-Japan CEPA, which has a similar focus. It's helped reduce tariffs on things like machinery, chemicals, and textiles, and strengthened economic ties between those two countries.
So they've got these agreements with some major players in the global economy.
Absolutely. And we shouldn't forget some of their earlier agreements, like the Free Trade Agreement with Sri Lanka, which focused on things like textiles, tea, and spices.
So they've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, they've been strategically using trade agreements to boost their autonomy and integrate themselves more into the global marketplace.
Okay, and what about the U.S.? That we talked about those potential negotiations earlier. Are those still in the works?
They are. Both sides are still talking and trying to hammer out a broader trade agreement.
And what's the main goal there?
The main goal is to reduce both tariffs and those non-tariff barriers that can sometimes make trade more difficult.
So basically just trying to make it easier and cheaper for businesses in both countries to do business with each other.
Exactly. It's about improving market access for everyone and strengthening those supply chains we talked about.
Makes sense. And on top of that, they're still working with those other partners like ASEAN, Japan, and South Korea, right?
Absolutely. They're constantly looking to expand and deepen those relationships.
So all these past and present agreements really show how seriously India takes this whole idea of using trade to boost their economy.
Yeah, they're definitely strategic players in the global trade game.
Okay, well, this has been a really interesting deep dive into a very complex situation. So let's try to sum up some of the key takeaways for our listeners.
Sounds good.
So first off, India's potential move to lower tariffs on all that stuff from the U.S., it's not happening in a vacuum. It's clearly linked to the possibility of the U.S. imposing tariffs on them in return.
Exactly. It's the strategic back and forth.
Yeah.
And it could have huge implications for the relationship between these two economic giants.
And as we've seen from those historical examples, tariffs are powerful tools, but they can also be really dangerous if they're not used carefully.
Yeah, they can have all sorts of unintended consequences and sometimes even make things worse instead of better.
So it's all about finding that balance between protecting your own interests and cooperating with other countries in a way that benefits everyone.
Absolutely. It's a delicate dance, and one that requires a lot of careful consideration.
All right, so here's a final thought for our listeners to chew on, given everything we've discussed today about tariffs and trade and history. What do you think the potential ripple effects of these India-US tariff changes might be on the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question to ponder. How will this affect other countries and global trade patterns as a whole?
And how does this information help you understand what you're seeing in the news and what might happen in the future with the global economy?
Lots to think about.
As always, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of global trade and tariffs. Until next time.
Take care.
See ya.